So I was going to
Okay,
say,
we're now recording. Thank you, Jared.
I was going to say, Ruth, off of what you were saying, I think there's so much to unpack with all of that. On one hand, a lot of what I've been studying recently has been in terms of the trauma that we're all going through, right? And there's personal trauma, there's communal trauma, community trauma, and then of course there's societal level trauma. And we all know this, that authoritarianism and the like, it feeds off of that. It feeds off of not just cyclical trauma, but also this feeling of like you said, the intractable nature of this situation, of people feeling alone and people feeling powerless. And the antidote to that every single time is community and intimacy and coming together and realizing, I mean, we're just starting this thing. It's a couple hundred people, probably going to be more before this thing is said and done, of people who care, of people who are empathic, people who want to come together and they want to fix things and they want to live better lives. And that just makes me feel very very privileged and very touched that we're doing this. And you couldn't be more right. This is exactly what should happen in the face of that.
Yeah, and it was interesting reading your book, that we both have family members, like so many, probably millions of people, who became radicalized. And they're two very different cases, but symptomatic. And so those of you who are lucid people, this story that my mother, who lives in England, and she's over 90, and she's always a conservative. The Queen was a big deal in our household. And but during the pandemic, she's in a village. She couldn't go out and have her coffees and stuff. So she started watching more television, and she started watching Russia Today, the Kremlin RT, the Kremlin propaganda arm. And she watched a lot of it. She really liked it. And so her politics began to shift from conservatism to extremism, great replacement theory. And then all of a sudden she said things like, I almost fell off my chair. She said, why isn't Biden helping Putin? And I know from studying the Kremlin playbook is that one of the big goals is to make people see the world in ways that helps the Kremlin. And so my mother, who was feeling alone and isolated, fell right into this and was just consumed with hatred for Biden. And I learned over the time that whatever her gripe was that day, it often reflected a talking point of the Kremlin, the latest one. So this was incredible. And Jared, do you want to talk, because you start your book with your grandmother, do you want to talk about that? That's a different case, but the end result mentality is a little bit the same.
Yeah, so I wanted to start this when I was younger and with my grandmother because I grew up in like a really really extreme evangelical home. We're not just talking about like fundamentalist type stuff. We're talking about conspiracy theories, white nationalism. I mean, one of the reasons why I realized back in like 2016 that this thing was on a bad track was because it was what I saw at home and what I saw in my church and what I saw in my community coming into the country at large. Since then, I have watched family members, loved ones, people from my hometown, that community, just absolutely go down the rabbit hole from Donald Trump to QAnon to white supremacist, white paramilitary groups, just some of the worst imaginable things. And it's so sad, but it also, I think, speaks to something else that we need to look at, which is why are these types of narratives effective? Why does it work? Why does and RT, by the way, is I don't think it gets credit enough for how powerful and how influential it has been. I mean, Putinism has spread around this world at such alarming speeds for a variety of reasons, right? Because it absolutely plays upon so many inherent fears that human beings have. Like, the way we started, like we just watched this terrible tragedy take place. It would be so easy to go down a path of anger and extremism, to just say, Like, I want to find power, I want to find a community, and instead of finding, like, a healthy community, I'm sorry, but Putinism, QAnonism, whatever we're talking about here, it creates a toxic, poisonous faux community for these people, right? And it weaves them together in their own sort of shared anti-reality, and it is a cycle that we've seen over and over again. And now we've reached a point where people feel very alone. They feel very powerless. They're looking for something. And the problem is, the best way you can profit, the best way that you can gain power is to take advantage of people who need something. And we're
Mhm.
watching people who are being ripped off. We're watching people who are being victims of grift. I mean, I'm sure you have this all the time. People say, "Oh, is Trumpism and all this, is it real or is it a grift?" And yes, it's both at the exact same time, right?
Mhm.
And those sort of needs are creating these openings for people to be radicalized and for these conspiracy theories and for this misinformation to flourish.
Yeah, and that's the authoritarian specialty, is that they create situations of crisis and they polarize and they spread hate ideologies and make people feel more alone and atomized than ever. There's a really good book. I don't think I sometimes when we do the Q&As, I mention books I've been reading, but there's a book I interviewed this woman, Norina Hertz is her name. And somewhere in the Lucid archive, there's a really good interview with her. And I fished it out the other day, and it's called The Lonely Century. And she's an economist, but she is diagnosing loneliness and atomization as one of the main, drivers of populism, authoritarianism. And the way that we know from Hannah Arendt, who wrote very movingly about how, authoritarianism makes people feel so lonely, people who are really living under it. But loneliness and alienation are also preconditions of creating an appetite for demagogues who say, I'm going to fix it. And I guess the other thing to say is, you mentioned the community, and this is something I'm going to write about in my next book. Unfortunately, authoritarians have been a lot more skilled at creating these communities. Now, their communities created on awful, right, premises, on hatred, on leader worship. But they have, like Trump, he went and said, I love you. You were forgotten and you're forgotten no longer, and I love you. And they use this language of emotion.
Yep.
Now, we know that it's simulated, this care. They despise their people, but the people don't know that. And they are really, and plus the rituals, the rallies, and it makes people have a home in a way that often Democrats with a small d around the world have just not been as attentive to those things. Like Erdogan, who's like a murderous despot, he cries a lot. I call it strategic crying. I've been waiting to write about this, a piece. I want to call it crocodile tears. But they all like do this emotion thing, and people love it. It makes them feel part of something.
Well, there's a rapture to it, right? I mean, one of the
Yes.
things I didn't understand until, like, I wrote the Midnight Kingdom is the reason that they're so much better at it. And what you just touched on is really, really important. They're so much better at creating that faux community because they're taking advantage of these foundations that are already there, right? So all Trump has to do is hug a flag, right? All he has to do is play, the national anthem, or say, don't take a knee during a football game or whatever. Those things are already ingrained in people. They're generational. Their families have been telling them the stories about that and about religion. All he has to do is come out and hold up a Bible upside down, and there's like a background reality that goes ahead and fills in everything that he doesn't have. But authoritarians do it all the time. I mean, they go ahead and they start taking over existing religions, existing traditions, and they start warping them, right? And what you just said, and it was something that I didn't really understand until, and by the way, what a line of work we're in, Ruth. Like what an incredible line of work. I didn't understand it until I was like, I don't know, 12 or 13 hours into watching, like, some sort of a Nazi rally at some point. And I was like, this is church. It's their own church. They're having like this big spectacle with these icons and iconography and all of that. And suddenly you realize, oh, what they're doing is it's a revival. It's saying, right, and that's what authoritarians always do. They say society is decadent and depraved, right? That secularism has gotten too far, women are getting too much power, gay and trans people are out there, like, testing the limits of all of this. And then they say, we have to find some of that old time religion. That's where we've lost our way. We've exercised that out. And then they go ahead and more or less bastardize it. And they have an easy entry point. And the problem, that small d democratic idea, so many of these institutions that we're talking about are created to keep small d democracy down. And you have to basically engage in almost iconoclastic activity to start pushing against those old ideas and start creating your own. And by the way, people's hair always bristles when I say this. You kind of have to find your own, not necessarily spirituality or faith or something, but you have to find something that you can believe in, right? Something that you can find. But you're exactly right. They have the advantage there. They have all the roads built for them that they take advantage of.
There's this guy who studies fascism in general, named Roger Griffin. He's a historian, and he has this. He talked a lot about this theory, and he himself was a big attender of raves. These mass dance parties. And so he wrote a lot about. He had this one article where he said Nazism was party time. Mm. And some historians, they didn't like that. They thought this was a very weird way to talk about it. But people had a good time at the rallies sometimes. Yep. And look at the Trump rallies, where, especially if you're in a democracy and you don't have secret, police standing there to see if you're cheering well enough, people, we know from all the reporting, you yourself were there at those rallies. People had a good time. So we kind of need to take this seriously, as reprehensible as we might, think it is. So I wanted to ask you a question about your book, and then we'll maybe take some questions. There's lots of questions people submitted, and thank you everybody for your great questions. What led you to go back into history? Because you go quite far back. And you're very masterfully cover many centuries, and with these themes of faith and faith gone bad and communities gone bad. What led you to do this at this time?
Well, first of all, you flatter me and you're too kind. But I'll try and roll through and keep composure here. Actually, we were talking, and I hope I'm not speaking outside school. We were talking before this about like what our book proposals are. And like, as well as I do, that one of the best things about research is you go in with a question. And the most amazing part about research is when your question changes. You all of a sudden you go in looking for one thing and you find another. I started writing about modern history, starting with so-called Western civilization, because as these statues are going down, as the 1619 project is happening, as all these battles over history are occurring, I kept hearing the extreme right talking about Western civilization. We have to protect it. And so I wanted to learn about it, and immediately, and it took like a week of like research in ancient Rome to realize, no, that's not what's happening. This is about how conspiracy theories, white supremacist lies, and religious mythologies protect the powerful and run throughout history. And what I found almost immediately is that what we're dealing with right now is not unprecedented, which everybody likes to throw around. This is a cyclical thing. Like, we watch all the time that authoritarianism, and this is something that is both, I think it's daunting, but also important, which is fascism, Nazism, whatever we want to call it, is part of the human condition. It's something that is around all the time, and you don't defeat it in war and it suddenly goes away. It's something that you have to deal with and the conditions that create it. And so what I realized very quickly was that I was writing a different book than even the book that I had started out to write.
Mhm. Yeah, well, when you said fascism doesn't go away after a war, that's actually part of why I wrote Strongmen, which starts with the fascist regimes. And then I was like, well, what happened to all these fascist impulses, this fascist mentality, this way of thinking about governance and other people? And so I traced it through, the Cold War dictatorships. Like I focused on Chile, but Brazil has been in the news. And then after that, we get to people like the Putins, the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, and there are these continuities, right? So
And I just want to add on that, because I by the way, Strongman is like, if it wasn't the book it would be by my bedside, it's one of those things
yeah.
though, because it's important. And somebody asked me this at a book event the other day. They said, what happens when these impulses are defeated in a war and they go away? And the truth is, one of the reasons we're in the situation we are now is because after World War II, well, actually, while World War II was still being fought, the Allies made a very conscious decision not to stamp out fascism and Nazism, but to reincorporate it in the battle against communism, right? All of a sudden, dictators became very useful. And it was like that old idea, which, by the way, is always how these things start, of keeping a dog on a chain. And over time, if you do not act in a principled stand, those dogs get off chains. And Putin's the exact same thing. They were so happy to have Putin in like the G8 and, have him as this trading partner. And they just kept hoping he's not going to go in Ukraine, or he's not going to do this, or he's not going to do that. And I think to go ahead and put a solution on the table, you have to have principles. You have to stop at some point and say, strongmen, dictators, authoritarians, this type of energy, like, you may think it's useful for whatever is going on in the world, but you have to push against it. You cannot let these people in power, and you cannot let, people do that.
Yeah, well, I agree fully. So maybe we can talk about a question that takes off from disinformation, since we
Let me
started.
ask you, because I just,
Oh yeah, of
talked
course.
at you for a minute. So I'll go ahead and start. This is from Pat. All right, Ruth. For both of us, how best to push back on ridiculous right-wing conspiracy theories and propaganda that is consuming our country and the world? In particular, my perennial and anguished question is about what we can do as individual citizens to push back on this creeping authoritarianism.
Yeah, so there are kind of two questions, and the conspiracy theories and disinformation. It's very interesting because the research that comes from people who study cults, like Stephen Hassan and many others, people who study disinformation and conspiracy theories, and people who study like leader cults, like I do, it converges in a few points. And some of them are things that we really maybe don't like to hear. And one is that, well, it's very tempting to just push these people away, these awful racists in your family or your acquaintances. That's actually not very useful, because it just sends them further into their own tribe, right? And so the counsel from all these different perspectives is, one person says, show care, not contempt. Care in the sense that you listen to them and you ask them why they feel this way. You don't challenge them and just say that's wrong. And I did this, as some of you know, when my mother started spouting this stuff, I was like just trying to refute it. And then I would send her things I myself had written, right? Thinking, okay, I'm her daughter, and so she's going to believe me. Well, she didn't believe me. She goes, well, it's CNN, and CNN's fake news. So that just doesn't work to try and refute it on grounds of logic. What is better, they say, from different perspectives, is to try and get at what it is that's driving them to believe these things in the first place, and not to judge that. And kind of, it's almost like create a holding zone where maybe you speak about other things, but you don't cast them off and hang up on them, as I confess I did with my mother more than once. um, and then when they're ready to emerge, some do, you're there. So what about you, Jared? I know you must have lots of lived wisdom about this.
There's a couple of things here. What I'm getting ready to say seems a little bit counterproductive, but I promise that this thing, and that's part of the issue here, right? So much of this is complicated. This is a complicated situation that we're in. The way that you get through to people is by not trying to win them over or get through to them. So in a way, like, okay, we've been cast into a world right now that is supposedly zero-sum politics, right? Either I win or you win, and that is trench warfare. And there is absolutely no way to win trench warfare. Just check with any, well, I guess there aren't any World War I veterans left. But anyway, moving along. The idea, though, is that people who are in these things, we talked about this a little bit earlier, they believe these things because they need something to believe in. Many of them, and this is something that I've been working on recently and what I'm now focusing on, we're not just in a political crisis. We're not just in a societal crisis. We're in a mental health crisis. We're in a position where people are lonely. They are afraid. And by the way, the exploitation that creates authoritarianism in the first place, it churns. It churns and churns and churns and churns. To a person, everybody that I've seen go down these rabbit holes, they're sad, they're lost, and they're alone. They're having financial crises, they're having relationship crises, housing crises, you name it. And part of it, by the way, is the fact that this society doesn't work. This society is traumatic and it makes people traumatized. And as a result, hurt people hurt people. And a large part of this, though, is don't go in looking to have an argument about Biden versus Trump. Don't go in looking to have Clinton versus Trump, red versus blue, Democrat versus Republican. What we have to do is we have to start engaging in intimacy. We have to start talking to people and having conversations. And by the way, if you're a Marxist, it's solidarity, right? It's talking to other people about what's going on in their lives and what's happening. That is the quickest, well, the only way to really do it. But I have to tell you, that's not easy. And a lot of these people that we're talking about, they can be dangerous. Hurt people. And so there has to be an attempt to talk to people and engage with people, but you also have to take care of yourself. And you have to get out of bad situations. There's abuse from this. There's domestic violence from this. There's political violence from all of this. But we have to, as a society, we have to have a sea change in terms of how we interact with each other and how we try and work with each other. And that is really, really hard. But at this point, there's no other choice.
Yeah, that's very well put. And the connection between it's not just a political crisis, it's a mental health crisis. That's so important. And certainly there are many things going on, even things that may have seemed innocuous before, just being on a social media platform, that can be very difficult for people today.
Can I respond real fast to something? Because I just seen somebody say, how do we do this on scale? Which is a huge question, and there's no way we're going to answer it in the next half hour. But I just want to say two things. One, going back to what you said about how things seem intractable, which is a perfect word for this moment. We can do things on our own. We can do things in our own lives. We can work to disabuse ourselves of the trauma that we've gone through and try and engage in better relationships and better communication. There has to be a large-scale movement in this country that starts investing in programs. There has to be pressure on politicians to get out of these giant bubbles that they're in and these feedback loops that they're in. There has to be something that goes grassroots to scale. And how that happens, we see it through history. It does happen. It is hard, though. And that's why authoritarianism, going back to what you were saying, Ruth, and you're exactly right. They are it's such an easier climb for them because it's not even a climb. It's almost like a downhill push, right?
Yeah. And, there are dozens and dozens of organizations just in America alone that are devoted to bridge building.
Yes.
There are many, many coalitions of organizations that are devoted to bridge building. There's all kinds of initiatives. One name for some of them is depolarization, where they bring people together. There are people who are they're in small towns and they're having meals. They're using food as a way in. And we had as a guest on Lucid, Fabio Parasecoli, who's a food historian who looks at food and nationalism and also how food can repair breaches. So there's all kinds of initiatives. It's just that we don't really hear about them we hardly hear about them individually, but there's actually a ton of energy being devoted to this. And we're not hearing about it as a systemic thing that's going on.
Well, it's not entertaining. That's the thing.
It's hard work. Yeah, it's hard work and it's meetings. It can seem boring. And so here we get to, we need to have narratives, a way of having narratives about these things that make them compelling. And I know this from studying Italy under Berlusconi, when you have a showman who comes, and this is why I wrote, if you follow Lucid, I wrote that article about Fox News, turning politics into spectacle. And this didn't start with Trump, obviously, it had, Ronald Reagan and stuff, but Trump was a showman and a fabulist, a liar, right? So politics he changed politics. And when you have that, it's very difficult to recover for the media, a kind of attention span that will cover these smaller things. And then you add in that smaller things that are very important, though. And then you add in the disappearance of local journalism. So it's very challenging, but it's if people don't know about it, the perception is that there's nothing being done, and then people are further despondent. So we really need to address this for mental health reasons too, for social reasons too. And it's the truth. There are tons of things going on. So.
Well, and you're exactly right. Trump, by the way, and this is important because he ushered in this zero-sum moment, right? Like, it is so much easier to get people riled up about what they're against than what they're for. There is no agenda within Trumpism. Trumpism is a Trojan horse that gets, right-wing, Heritage Foundation, anti-tax, libertarian, pro-wealth things across the board. But here's the thing. We have to move away from how do we defeat Trump? How do we defeat these people? And we have to start offering an idea for what the future should look like. And that's part of the thing, right? That's not there right now. I mean, there are tons of people who say different things, but you're exactly right. The problem is that if the media, by the way, runs on constant fear, like, oh my God, what is happening over here? What did they do today? What's happening here? And there's no profit incentive to go in and talk about how do you have better schools? How do you have healthcare? Those things don't work within this thing. And I got to say, one thing that we can do, because whenever we talk about the media, it's a problem. We have to make a decision, which is we have to vote with our dollars and our attention and our clicks and our focuses. And like, that's hard. That's really, really hard, which again, it goes back. Somebody I saw said in the comments that said they're on easy mode. Yes, they are on easy mode. And like, this is all hard that we're talking about. It is actually really hard work.
Yeah. So I'm going to pick a question for you that for also selfish reasons, because it's something that I can't answer. And I have a feeling you can, and I'm curious about it. It's from
Well,
Karen.
I hope so. That's high pressure. Okay, let's go.
Well, actually, one of the rules of Lucid is that everyone knows this by now, is that I always say there's no bad question, but I can't provide all the answers. And sometimes I just can't answer. And there's some people who've been asking things and I can never answer them. And I'll say, I'm going to look it up and find out for you. And then that sometimes doesn't happen. So they're very patient, these people. Okay, so this is from Karen, and this has to do with the Republican, efforts to tank the economy by not raising the debt ceiling. I'm also increasingly nervous, as someone who depends on Social Security, disability, how the suffering quotient will rise as a result of this continued coup. And that's a very good way to put it, the prolongation of the coup. And I have things to say about the playbook of chaos, but if you could address any or all part of this, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I'll end by talking about the chaos part at the very, very end. Very, very quickly, and this is something that, if people are reading your stuff or reading my stuff, they know this. Like, there are no silver bullet explanations for why anything happens. There's always complicated, interlocking things. First of all, we have to get rid of this idea that the Republican Party is in lockstep with each other. They are currently in an ideological civil war. There are so many different factions within the GOP who are jockeying for control. Everybody from Mitch McConnell Republicans to Kevin McCarthy, who tries to straddle both things and is getting run over almost every day because of it, to national conservatives, to Trumpists who would much rather have their own reality shows. But within all of this, there are different groups that are jockeying for different things. One, there are grandstanders who tried to hold up the McCarthy thing simply to gain more power over the legislative process. There are other ones who literally would love to destroy the economy because guess what? People always trust Republicans to fix the economy. And going back to the chaos idea, authoritarianism thrives in it. If things fall apart and people are looking for answers, they're sometimes going to look for authoritarians to put things to right, regardless of how that happens. But there are others as well, and this is something that is becoming very clear. The expression of our current political climate and also the market is that we have to start getting rid of so-called entitlements.
Yeah.
And this entire thing is going to lend itself to some sort of a grand bargain to go ahead and probably, and we just saw this in France, probably do something like raise the retirement age, probably change, the requirements for people to get this. Social Security has been on the chopping block since the moment that Social Security was passed. Medicare has been on the chopping block since the moment. They are going to use every opportunity that they can to go ahead and push this. And I do have to say, unfortunately, that that's probably where this is going. I mean, I think with this administration, also with the Democratic resistance that we have, there probably will be some sort of a bargain that gets done here. I hope I'm wrong, but everything sort of tells me that that's where this is going.
Yeah, unfortunately, that makes sense. Do you want to pick a question?
Yeah. Okay. So this was something I wanted to hear you talk about too. Okay, so this is from Randolph. The stormy interregnum. And by the way, what a word, interregnum. Perfect word. The stormy interregnum that we find ourselves in is hardly the first in humanity's political history. Please describe examples of previous transitions of uncertainty that some countries have used as wombs to birth a healthier social order.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, the 1930s, because of the threats of fascism, was a time of enormous experimentation, and including within democracies, where obviously I'm not a US historian, but all of the large scale programs that were passed. And, there was a really interesting interchange in the 1930s where people from Italian fascism, which was itself an experiment with state assistance and private versus public, a terrible experiment, but very different than what came before. They were traveling to the US to see how the New Deal was being played out. And they were also traveling to Stalinist Russia to see what was going on with that. So there were a lot of uncertainty, a lot of experimentation, but out of that awful period, came the foundations of our post-war international democratic order. So that's collapsing a lot into, but that's one example for sure.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the 30s because I think the closest thing to talking about this is the 1930s in the United States of America. One of sort of the conventional history that we get told is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected and suddenly everything was totally fine and everybody got on board with the New Deal. Guess what? That's not at all what happened. There was severe pushback against him. The wealthiest people and corporations in this country started investing in right-wing groups, including like offshoots of the KKK. If you haven't already, look up the Black Legion. It's incredible, like what these people did. Of course, there was a reported coup attempt called the Business Plot that tried to take over the country and remove Roosevelt. But the whole point of this is before the New Deal kicked in, and by the way, for the record, had absolute racist, white supremacist parts to it. There is absolutely a problem within the New Deal that we should look at and learn from now. But if you actually look at what happened, Roosevelt very, very intelligently realized that the country was starting to go down a fascistic path. There were, I mean, it wasn't just American Nazis. We're talking American fascists. We're talking about fascist groups. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, including the America First movement, right? What he realized was that you have to address the material conditions that make all this possible. And the New Deal put a bunch of people to work who might have otherwise put on an armband and goose stepped down Main Street. And one of the things that happens is we start to see a country that invests in its people. It moves away from laissez-faire or, pro-wealth policies. And there was a great society that took place. The problem in all of this, and we touched on this a little bit earlier, Ruth, is that the fight against fascism didn't end it, right? It ended up being co-opted into these minor dictators and movements, everything from Operation Gladio to Operation Condor, that were being used in order to go after leftists and make the world safe for international financial capitalism. So we don't know what could have happened. It's almost like looking at Reconstruction and seeing how that was thwarted, or how that was thrown off. This interregnum that we're talking about here, we could have something better, but we also have to recognize like how dangerous this actually is. I mean, the conditions are pretty good here for this.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, you got one?
Yeah, from Lance for both of us. I'd love to hear what you both think about Ron DeSantis. Always up for talking about Ron DeSantis. As he's becoming the mainstream authoritarian of choice. But what about somebody like Mike Pompeo? So Ron DeSantis. So I guess my big picture answer, and some of you have heard this before, but when somebody like Trump or Berlusconi, when they come into the system, they get into the political system, they profoundly change it. They change, as we discussed, the meaning of politics. They reduce it to spectacle and nihilism and violence. But they form a model of leadership. And here it's male leadership in this case. And a certain model of relating to others, which is trying to dominate them, bully them, the authoritarian model. And so this changes which qualities are valued in the political class. And we're seeing a profound transformation of the GOP, where certain people are pushed out, and who is in. They're criminals, they're extremists, they're fraudsters. So of course, George Santos is on the Small Business Committee. That's just how this is the upside down world of authoritarianism. But in the case of Ron DeSantis, so it's this example of how when you have a Trump in a system, they birth imitators. And Pompeo too. Do you remember how Pompeo, who's always, excuse my language, an ass, right? We know he was a bully at the CIA. He's just a terrible person. But he came into his full awfulness because Trump rewarded that. And the point of Trump was to make everyone be their worst selves possible. And he rewarded that so that the bar of behavior goes down to his, and they're all just as corrupt as him. So Pompeo, as Secretary of State, he just behaved abominably. And he's there as the chief diplomat. And his idea was, remember, he started talking about swagger, right? Like machismo. This was classic Trumpism. So that's example of, he's a very dangerous, a terrible person. But Ron DeSantis is the most dangerous of all because he absorbed all of Trump's methods. He studied Trump. He imitates his hand gestures. He made his infant into a prop for, Trump world. He made his infant's crib into an altar for Trump when he needed Trump's endorsement when he was running for governor. The man is a classic transactional, being a chameleon. and very extremist, but far too smart to say, oh, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone. He's just like, he's not going to do that. So thus, he's the quiet extremist. He's the extremist who will let people feel good about themselves because he seems okay. He goes to fish fries and he goes to bakeries. Follow his Instagram. If you, I read it like, oh my God, there he is again. And he has like a fake reptilian smile, but he poses every day. He's out there vlogging. He poses with, Betty at the bakery. So he's the man of the people. So he's learned all this from Trump, and we're seeing him attempting to make his personality cult. He has no charisma. This is the problem. But so he's an example of how the system births mini Trumps. So as you see, I love Ron DeSantis, and his press people know how much I love him, and they're constantly at me. So I think I've said enough. I shall pass it to you.
Well, I'll just say Pompeo is such a worm. And, one of the things that we've seen from Pompeo the most, I mean, like, just absolutely no moral or ethical compass whatsoever, and he's a bully, and he is a white Christian nationalist, and he is birthed from the same sort of Bill Barr branch of all of this, which is the idea of like the elite, the white wealthy evangelical men rule the world, and everybody else just needs to shut up and get out of their way. Pompeo is not going to be the nominee of the Republican Party because they recognize the worm. Like he is the type that he'll probably be in another administration is what'll happen, or possibly be like an ambassador to somewhere, heaven forbid. DeSantis is really scary. And DeSantis is scary for everything that you just laid out absolutely exquisitely, Ruth. The other thing that is really frightening about this moment, and you brought this up earlier, which is people are very tired right now. And one of the things that happens within authoritarian systems is that the constant cultural battles wear people out. I mean, literally, we just had 2 weeks ago is like we were sitting here having a conversation about whether or not gas stoves cause childhood asthma, and it gets turned into the jackbooted thugs are coming for you, and all this. And I have to say, for all of the progressive principles that are espoused in this country, many of them are espoused without any sort of skin being put in the game. We can put out signs that say, in this house we believe in love, or that gay and trans people deserve rights, and that Black people deserve to be treated well. Those are slogans that you can say on social media sometimes, but when push comes to shove, are you there to fight for it? And what I have noticed that really frightens me is that there are a lot of people, supposed liberals, who are out there talking themselves into Ron DeSantis. They're already saying, you know what,
Yeah.
I'm so tired of this. I'm so tired of all these cultural battles. And we've seen this, right? They're saying, listen, we see it with centrists. We see it with one article, an op-ed after another, which is like, what's happening on those woke campuses, or what's happening with gay and trans people, and all this. Ron DeSantis makes the appeal, I'm not Donald Trump, right? But I am going to put things to order. And some people want order, particularly people who have wealth and people who have power, because they don't want anything to bother that. They don't want any chancing of that. The other part with DeSantis that frightens me, he has the missing component, well, two missing components that Trump didn't. He has the discipline and the support of the donor class, the way that Trump only had a taste of. Right? Trump got the money whenever he was doing things for them, and that's that. The other part of it is the missing component in all of this. We've got the conspiracy theories, the authoritarian energies. We've got white Christian nationalism. The one thing that we're missing is the militarism. And
Yeah.
DeSantis has that. And if DeSantis is able to put that together, as well as the masculine component of it, that's frightening to me. That's an appeal that, like, in particularly if we have an economic crisis, I think we could see the media talking themselves into him. I think we could see a lot of people backing him in a way that Reagan won over a lot of Democrats in the 1980s.
Yeah, I agree. And the New York Times has run one op-ed and one other kind of piece about saying that he's normal. It's like he's not normal. He's extremely dangerous. And I did an op-ed for CNN. By now it's like, I don't know, not a year ago, but many months ago, to try and push back at this narrative, to show, the op-ed was about how many people, small businesses in Florida, were suing DeSantis for his intrusions into the private sphere. And there's a lot of pushback. This is, again, we're not hearing about it. And it was interesting, the op-ed didn't do very well. So I was told it didn't get enough traction, but it's a big story because there's been a lot of pushback and a lot of suits against DeSantis in different realms. But the business is important because those people are influential. And I think if we want to think about, there were many questions, what do we do? We have to always have a broad-based coalition to fight. Many sectors of society have to come together. And one of the most influential can be business, finance, business. And there are very interesting initiatives by people, and I sometimes lecture to and with them, trying to talk to business owners and business people, corporate world, about why it's in their interest to support democracy and why it's not in their interest to support authoritarianism. And there's really a whole other type of messaging that needs to be out there where, so I've tried this before with gun violence. I'm not going to go to conservatives and start talking about restricting their gun rights. I'll say, is 280 billion a year good for the economy? I don't think so. And no one would agree that a 280 billion cost, which is what I think is it million or billion? Somebody might know.
It's billion.
But it's an enormous sum. That's what gun violence cost the economy, and the ripple effect with people being out sick from work, community ravages. That's a talking point. The same with the worry about political violence, civil strife. That's bad for business. So you can go into the outcomes, the either real outcomes in issues we know about already, like gun violence, or run a model. And people do this, that we could do it easily. And that's a way to get these allies. It's not easy, but you have to try, because there's a saying, if you study authoritarianism, elites make and break the strongmen, the enablers, religious, financial, business, all types of enablers. And so I'm trying to do more with business community and corporate community, because this is just an outgrowth of educating people.
And I just want to add on to that, because you're exactly correct. The issue right now, like, none of this is happening in a vacuum. The problem is that this system doesn't work right now. This doesn't work because there's too much concentrated wealth on one side. And every time that happened, by the way, you go back to the 20s and 30s, that's what happened there as well. And then you have to start making decisions. And if a system doesn't work, you have to make decisions, which is, do you reform the system or do you enforce the system, right? Do you square the circle using violence and oppression? And do you give, basically, do you give privilege and power to white people and then hurt everybody else and, wipe out like almost an entire group of people, right? In all of this, there is a ready-made answer that nobody is talking about whatsoever, which is tax the people who are not being taxed. Tax the wealthy, tax the corporations. And by the way, you want to go back to the idea of the elites. Many of them are screaming for this. Many of them are saying, please tax me, you have to. There are a small group that are trying to basically get rid of taxes altogether. This is a solution this is a false solution to a false problem. The idea that we need some sort of a strong man to come in and make sure that the trains run on time and people go to work for less money. And at the heart of all this, it's doing things like getting rid of Social Security, making sure that we get rid of regulations, we get rid of all of these perks, quote unquote perks that were, the progress of the 20th century. That's what they're talking about. That's what all of these movements are about deep, deep down. The answer to all of it is no, we need a reinforcement of a society that is fairer, more human, and more decent, and also invest in people. Like that, the regime of austerity and
Yeah.
concentrated capital has to stop.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Austerity has just been a nightmare.
Um,
Um,
do
so
you have
Ruth,
a last one or
yeah, I think we can't. There's an interesting question uh, from Mike, but it says for Ruth, but it's really for both of us, I think. Or we could take something else if there
let's
was
do it family style. Let's just do it.
one. Okay.
Yeah.
Mike says this might be a weird question, but as people researching this, but also living it, what's that like? Do you remember when you first realized something was wrong? And if it's not too much, I'd love to hear what gives you hope. That's also why I thought this was a good end question. So do you want to take that first, Jared?
Yeah, so I realized in 2016 going in these Trump rallies that something really ugly was starting to take form. I knew back then that this thing was going to take off. I knew that it was going to get worse and worse and worse. I didn't have the understanding. I didn't have the background. I didn't have the research. I didn't have the information. I have to tell you now that I have the information, first of all, I always tell students of mine, like, what is horror? Horror is believing that you were safe when all along you were in danger, right? It's sitting there watching a movie and someone's creeping up behind you. This thing has been taking shape well before we were alive, and it has now reached this critical mass. I feel better knowing what's going on and feel better knowing the history and knowing all this stuff. So it arms me with that. So it helps me to understand. But I have felt more hopeful in the past couple of years because we have conversations like this, because
Yeah.
we compare notes, because there are people who want to talk about this and they want to ask for solutions. The problem is that the solutions are both easier and harder than we think that they are. It's easier because we have to confront things within ourselves, we have to have better relationships, we have to heal from this trauma, and we have to project it outwards. The hard part is that this is a historically important, dangerous moment. And we need to recognize that in order to facilitate and even, I would say, accelerate this change. But for me, it is, I'm not nihilistic. I'm not in my cups. I feel very optimistic, but I also have to look at it every single day with an understanding of the importance of it.
Yeah, and you part of your book, and I think the epilogue, you say that it's in order to get beyond this and fix this, we have to look it squarely in the face. You say it more elegantly, but that's what you're saying. And I made the same point in the conclusion of Strongmen that every culture I learned when I wrote the book was in denial.
Yep.
It's not just Americans who have, oh, we're democracy, the American exceptionalism. Everybody's always been in denial. The Germans were in denial. And even Leon Trotsky was writing, trying to get the German left to collaborate with the unity. And nobody would listen. So that's just, I think it's just, when the stakes are high and it means you might have to change your life and do something, or you become paralyzed by fear, or you have an early brush with something unpleasant, a threat, a threat of a professional setback or for you or your child, or then you don't want to engage, and it's easier to stay quiet. And the whole, the woke thing, every time I read the word woke, I think of a quote that I put in Strongmen, and it was from a taxi driver. Some of you may have heard this before, but in Santiago, in Chile. And as a taxi driver, he witnessed all the resistance efforts of young people and others and union leaders. But he said that dictatorships want to put people to sleep, and it's youth who are always the first to wake up. And so the Republican, every time I hear them criticizing people who are woke, I think, yeah, you want us to go to sleep. You want us to just be in sleep mode, right? silent, eyes closed, not too afraid to speak out, or too blinded by ideology, by disinformation to speak out. So it's incredible to be living through such a frontal assault, where they're just being very open about it. They want you to be non-woke. Non-woke is asleep. So for me, to answer Mike's question, it's scary sometimes. I have had numerous moments of having a kind of terrible realization that not a clairvoyance, but a very clear sense of what might happen. And then I would write pieces for CNN, and they would be like, "Are you sure you want to publish this?" So they would publish it, to their great credit. And then it would happen. But there's also been a comfort in, to go back to something Jared was saying about the cyclical nature, there is a comfort in knowing that other countries have gone through this, and they have gotten through it. It's been awful, but they've gotten through it, and it looks different every time. We're not going to have a Gaddafi for 42 years. That's just not going to happen, or a Franco for 36 years. That's just not how it is.
I'm going to knock on wood, Ruth.
They don't last that long today. Although Putin's been in power now as long as Mussolini, which is pretty sobering, which is why he's in this big mess. It's a different topic for another time. But I also do feel hope, because the history of authoritarianism is the history of resistance to it. And we're living through actually a record time of protest all over the world. Nonviolent mass protest. 2019 was a record year, and it's only gotten more common since then. So there are plenty of things going on to give us hope. I think that to go back to the self-help and mental health aspect, we just have to know to step away when it's too much, and not feel obligated to follow everything. And it will all be there when we come back refreshed to continue the struggle. So I think that we are out of time. So we did not answer many of your questions. I'm sorry about that. Maybe I will address some, and maybe Jared would too, in future essays, or we'll have to have a round two, Jared.
Hey, I could do this anytime. This has been a great joy. And, again, I just want to say I appreciate you terribly. What you just said, I think, is exactly right. This is the easiest thing to do right now would be to turn this off. It is. And by the way, that's what Trumpism is about. The whole thing is just like, no, you don't have a problem. We don't have a problem. They're lying to you and trying to take advantage of you. This is an exhausting time. And we were told, after the 2020 election, Ruth, everything's going to be fine. It's back to normal. Everything's good. Take care of yourself. Take care of the people around you. Keep fighting. Keep doing this, because, and by the way, if you want to talk about self-interest, I keep saying this, you can seed these people ground. And I'm telling you that it's not going to stop there. Like, if you do not do this fight, it's going to be the people you love. It's going to be the communities you love. It's going to be you that's against the wall. And we have to keep fighting, but we have to take care of ourselves. I always tell people, savor the victories. They are few and far between, and find the people you can trust and find the community. And just to say thank you again, Ruth. I appreciate being part of your community and the community that you have. It's wonderful.
Likewise, and congratulations on your book. It's incredibly important work. I can only imagine the amount of time and effort it took to write such a sweeping, amazing book. So thanks to everybody. It's been really fun to have combined forces, and I hope we do it again.
All right.
Okay, bye. Good night,
Everyone.
everybody.
Good night.